What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here, and in this next section of microeconomics, we're going to talk about demand versus supply, and we're going to combine them. So in the last two sections, we looked at demand and supply separately, which if you didn't watch the two sections, as a side note, highly recommend you do before watching this one. And so in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to combine both of those concepts. So what I'm going to do to start off is a diagram of putting both the supply curve and the demand curve on the same graph. So remember, we had a graph, separate graphs for a demand curve, for a supply curve. So a supply curve looked like this, and then a demand curve looked like that. And so if we combine them, that's how it's going to look. Now notice that they both intersect at this point here. And this point, it's called market equilibrium. Notice that at this point here, the quantity demanded on this curve is equal to the quantity supplied. And so what this means, market equilibrium, let's kind of describe it in words. It means that the quantity consumed by consumers of a certain good or service is equal to the quantity produced by producers. Okay, another way to look at this point here is that consumers and producers are in agreement, quote unquote. Another expression sometimes you'll see in certain textbooks is at this point here, the market clears, which is just another way to say that the consumers and the producers are in agreement. Basically, the quantity consumed by consumers, the demand, equals the quantity produced by producers equals the supply. Now, at this point here, notice that there's a certain price, let's call it P1, and there's a certain quantity, let's call it Q1. So this P1 here, it's called the equilibrium price. And this Q1 here, it's called the equilibrium quantity. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to talk about how certain market factors affect that market equilibrium right there. And more specifically, how that equilibrium price and that equilibrium quantity are going to be affected. Before getting into that though, I want to first talk about what happens when the market is out of equilibrium or not in equilibrium. And that can actually happen in two different ways. So either the market price can be greater than the equilibrium price. This is the equilibrium price. Either the market price could be greater or it could be less than the equilibrium price. So let's look at both cases separately. Let's first look at what happens when the market price, the price at which the good or service is selling in the market right now, what happens when the market price is greater than the equilibrium price. And we can actually show this case here visually on this graph. So if the market price is greater than the equilibrium price, so let's say it's up here. So let's call this P2. So this right now is the current market price. Well, what's going to happen on the demand curve and the supply curve, respectively? Well, at this price here, we could draw a horizontal line. Notice that this here is going to be the quantity demanded. If we draw a line down, this is going to be the quantity demanded. This is, at this price here, this is the quantity that consumers are willing to buy or consume this good or service. And then on the supply side, it's going to be this point here. So notice this is going to be the quantity supplied. At this price here, this is how much producers are willing to make of the product. So notice that from here, what we can see is that the quantity supplied is going to be greater than the quantity demanded. That's always going to happen if the market price is greater than the equilibrium price. And if you think about intuitively what that means, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So the amount produced is going to be greater than the amount consumed. The amount produced is going to be greater than the amount consumed. So what that's going to mean is that the producer is going to have excess inventory. And that is called a surplus. Right? There's going to be excess inventory on the producer's hands, which is not good. Producers don't want to have excess inventory. They want to sell all their inventory. But the fact that there's more produced than consumed, there's going to be that surplus, that excess inventory. And you can actually quantitatively get the surplus. It's going to be the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded. So if we put actual numbers here, let's say the quantity demanded here is 100 and then this is like 300. The surplus in this case is going to be the 300 minus the 100, so it's going to be 200 units. The producer is going to have 200 extra units on hand that they haven't sold. Now, what happens in the market if there are no restrictions? That's important to note. So with no restrictions, the market, or the interaction between consumers and producers, the market always drives the price, the market price, to the equilibrium price. Okay, and this with no restrictions is pretty important because we're going to see in a future video that there can be restrictions sometimes that prevent this from happening, especially if government gets involved. So we'll talk about when there's like a price floor or a price ceiling on a product, what's going to happen then. That'll be in a future video, but let's pretend that there's no restrictions right now. And if there are no restrictions, then the market's always going to drive that market price to the equilibrium price if it's not in equilibrium already. But let's specifically talk about how that's going to happen. So we're here right now. We know that the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So right now what's going to happen, so how do we get from the market price? Actually, you know what? I'm going to erase this, give myself some room here for this explanation. So how do we get from the market price to the equilibrium price? What's the specific process going to be? So right now, producers have excess inventory or they have surplus. And as I mentioned, they don't want to have surplus. They don't want to have excess inventory. So producers have surplus and want to get rid of it. Okay, but what's happening is at this price, unfortunately, the consumers won't buy the surplus. They won't buy that excess inventory. And so, unfortunately for the producer, the only way that they're going to get rid of it is they got to lower this price here. So the next step is that the producer lowers the price. So a good example of this is like retail shops at the end of seasons, right? They have excess inventory, stuff they maybe haven't sold in the winter, right? And now summer's approaching, so the demand is just not there. So things will go on sale, right? It'll be like an end of season sale. So that's a good example of when this happens. So the producer is going to lower the price. And if they lower the price enough, then the consumer will now buy the surplus. Let's just assume that the producer lowered the price enough where the consumer is going to buy that surplus for sure. And so what happened in this scenario here. So we started at the market price. Okay, so now the price went down. Producers lowered the price. Consumer is going to buy the surplus, so now the quantity demanded went up. But now at that lower price, producers will produce less in the future at the new price. So the price went down, the producer lowered the price, the quantity demanded went up, consumers are buying now. But at that price, the quantity supplied is going to go down. So notice how we went to equilibrium. So the price went down. Notice it went from P2 to P1. The quantity demanded went up. This went up. And then the quantity supplied went down. Because now that price is lower in the market, producers don't have as much of an incentive to produce that same quantity of the product. So the quantity supplied is going to go down. And so now we reach that market equilibrium, or let's call it equilibrium price. You could put market equilibrium as well. I'll just keep it consistent though. Okay, so if you ever get a question on the test asking, describe what happens when the market price is greater than the equilibrium price, this is exactly what happens. And this is kind of like a little flow diagram to show the process. So now let's talk about what happens in the other case. What happens when the market price is going to be less than the equilibrium price? And like the previous case, we could show it visually. So now this is the equilibrium price. Let's say that the market price is right here at P2. So now this is the market price. And notice that the market price is less than the equilibrium price. So if we draw a horizontal line, what's happening on the supply curve? What's happening on the demand curve at that price right there? Well, at the supply curve, notice that this here is going to be the quantity supplied. And then at this price here on the demand curve, this here is going to be the quantity demanded. So at this price, consumers want this much of the product, that's the demand, but producers are only producing this much. That's how much they're willing to produce at that price right there. And so notice that in this case, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And when this happens, what that means is that consumers are not getting enough of the product because producers only produce this much here. But consumers want that, so there's a shortage in the market. And if you want to quantitatively get a shortage, it's basically equal to the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied. Notice this is always going to be a positive number if this is happening, if the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So again, if this is like 100 and this is 300, the shortage is going to be 200 units, the difference between those. Okay, but as we mentioned, if there's no restrictions, what's going to happen is eventually the market, the interaction between consumers and producers, is going to drive that price and those quantities to that market equilibrium. But more specifically, what happens? Well, right now, consumers are not getting enough of a product, right? There's a shortage. And what producers start seeing is that they're getting this crazy demand. Everyone is wanting their product, but unfortunately, they can't supply that excess demand, right? Because it's at this price here. But what's a producer always trying to do? They're trying to maximize the profit. So with all this demand coming at them, and they only have this much to supply, if they increase the price, what's going to happen is that their profit's going to go up. And so that competition, quote unquote, between consumers, that excess demand, competition between consumers is going to force the producer to increase the price. Because again, they're trying to maximize profit. So the competition between the consumers is going to force the producer to increase the price. Now, at that increased price now, because the price goes up, if the price goes up, notice that producers are willing to increase production. At higher price. Right? Because the price is higher, producers are willing to increase production even though their costs are going to go up. If the price is compensating enough for those costs, then if their profit keeps going up, they'll just increase production at that higher price. But unfortunately, there's going to reach a certain point where consumers are going to start buying less at that increased price. So eventually what's going to happen is consumers will buy less or demand less at increased price. You could use different words here. Maybe these aren't the best words that I'm using. But hopefully you get what I'm saying here. Hopefully you intuitively understand what's happening here, the flow of it. So consumers will buy less at that increased price. Okay, so more specifically, if we show this through a flow diagram, what happens? So we're at a market price. Remember, we're in the case where that market price is going to be less than the equilibrium price. So consumers are not getting enough, so the competition between consumers for that limited quantity that the producers are making, for that limited supply, is going to force the producer to see that and increase the price. They're trying to maximize the profit. So when this happens, the first thing that's going to happen is the producer is going to increase the price. So there's going to be a price increase. At that price increase now, producer is selling the product at a higher price in the market. Well, now they're willing to produce more, right? They're going to be compensated for those extra costs. So now the quantity supplied is going to increase. But at some point, the price is increasing. Consumers are going to buy less. At some point, they're not going to have as much of a demand with that price increase. So that quantity demand, it's going to go down. And then eventually, we'll get to that equilibrium price. Right? So that's the series of events that happens when the market price is less than the equilibrium price. And again, with no restrictions, that's how you get from that market price to that equilibrium price. Right? So two different scenarios that can happen. If the market is out of equilibrium, there can either be a surplus or a shortage. So now what we're going to cover in the next video, it might be a next set of videos, we'll see how long it is. But we're going to talk about what happens to this equilibrium, this market equilibrium, when the demand and the supply start changing. So in the previous sections, we talked about how there could be a change in demand, change in supply. There was all those different factors we talked about. Well, what happens when there's an increase in demand? If that demand curve shifts to the right, well, notice that that market equilibrium is going to change. Or if it shifts to the left, market equilibrium is going to change. What if both are shifting? The supply and the demand curve, they're both shifting. right? So we're going to go over a bunch of cases, how that equilibrium price and that equilibrium quantity are affected with a change in demand and supply.